joining us this afternoon for Assimilation, the first topic in our Cohesion Amongst Chaos BIPOC Summer Speaker Series. My name is April Whirl. I'm a mixed Filipino-American painter and the co-chair of the Cohesion Art Collective. Our mission is to connect and amplify local BIPOC artists. We believe that art intrinsically creates representation, sparks conversation, and is an accessible way to share and learn about culture. We are thrilled to spotlight 4 BIPOC artists on stage today. Writer and storyteller Chris Latray, contemporary dancer Michelle Boule, and artist Riley James. Leading our discussion today is the very talented Joseph Grady. Joseph Grady is an actor, artist, and higher education professional with many film and television roles to his credit. Joseph is a graduate of UM with a degree in social work and focuses in Native American studies and theater. He has served the Missoula community in a public speaking capacity for more than a decade and has repeatedly answered the call to advocate for social justice in the region. Joseph has served on various boards and committees like the Missoula Food Bank's Anti-Racism Task Force, UM's Critical Advising Practices for Equity Committee, the Media Training Center's Indigenous Cultural Outreach Film Committee, the Missoula Children's Theater's DEI Committee, and the former chair of Tell Us Something's Board of Directors. In his professional academic career, Joseph Grady serves as the Associate Director for Montana 10 at the University of Montana and Missoula College. In this role, Joseph has been integral in increasing enrollment at UM by providing specialized cultural leadership with a focus on student support, mentorship, and guidance. Please welcome our panel.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Of course, our purpose here being to elevate BIPOC voices in the community. And in this frame, of course, we're having a discussion about artwork. So welcome to today's conversation. We will be discussing assimilation. My name is Joseph Grady. I use he, him pronouns. I'm enrolled Blackfeet. Let's see, I want to acknowledge my own male privilege in this space for the purpose of being respectful. This is a conversation and we are not here as experts per se, but there being diversity represented here, I do think we have our own informed experiences. Just really quickly, let's take a moment to acknowledge and reflect on the tens of thousands of years of Indigenous history in this place, from its earliest inhabitants dating back to a time immemorial, to the most recent peoples pushed out by a manifest destiny. Let's also be mindful that as Indigenous peoples, we still exist and thrive in these ancient and sacred spaces. So please be respectful and mindful of that experience as we gather in this space today. As BIPOC who live here locally, we bring our own personal experience from throughout our lifetime to the creative process in some way or another. Sometimes those factors are quite nuanced, while others take a more direct path to interpretation. That said, we are not locked into tragedy and plight narratives. Certainly the struggles and oppression felt throughout BIPOC communities are deeply felt by many, and the tragedy of police violence is not lost on us. However, this is not the sum of our parts, and though we do place considerable energy into organizing around the losses we see happening every day, we do also embrace celebration and mirth. I'm sure today's conversation has the opportunity to move in any of those directions, and so I ask our audience to please recognize and acknowledge the courage and generosity from our amazing panelists here today who have agreed to join us. So please, let's give a warm round of applause for our panelists who joined us today, these amazing creative talents. Thank you. All right, moving forward, let's be mindful, attentive, and intentional in our listening as we take this time to now meet our panelists. And to begin the conversation surrounding this topic of assimilation, let's just first please introduce ourselves and perhaps share with the audience a little bit about your creative outlet and what you do here locally. Chris, let's start with you.
Miigwech for that. Bonjour, Indinui Maganadug, Ani, that is hello, all of my relatives in Ojibwe, which is the language of my people. I'm enrolled with the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. I'm a descendant of the Pembina tribe, of the mighty Red River of the North, which is the current boundary of North Dakota and Minnesota, drains all the way north into Hudson's Bay. That's where my people come from. My art is words, sometimes delivered as I am right now, just with my voice. Sometimes it's poetry, sometimes it's essays, sometimes it's fiction. It's all storytelling. So when people ask me what I do, I say I'm a storyteller. When people ask who I am, I say I am a proud Anishinaabe.
Hi, my name is Michelle Boule. I live here. I was born in Illinois, and my mom is from the Philippines, so she also has some Chinese and Spanish in her. My dad was born in Illinois. His great-grandparents, French, Canadian, Lithuanian, German, probably some other things. And I'm a dancer, and I just kind of want to respond to this introduction as well, that dancing for me shows up in whatever form is present in this moment. It can be literally dancing. For me, it's really movement. And how do we allow movement to happen in our lives with integrity within our own bodies and spirits? So I do a lot of videos on Instagram, and I also have a coaching business, and I have an energy healing practice. So that is deep movement for me. And it's something I've studied for a long time because of my own injuries. So I do it in my own life, and I share it with others who also want to move and be moved.
Shalom. My name is Riley James Jacobson. I am an artist who lives here in town. Gosh, what a blessing to be on stage with all of you and sharing this space. I guess in the same vein, when it comes to art, I feel that life is art. Existence is the highest form of art. It's a creative process where we're interacting with trees and nature and the universe, and I strive to manifest that and express that through my music, and in a lot of other areas of my life, whether from how I speak or to how I dress or how I work. I feel that as a musician, I have a social responsibility to utilizing my craft and my talents to benefit mankind, to play the part that I possibly can in being a positive influence in this world. Music is a really unique art form in that regardless of people's languages or backgrounds or cultures, you can listen to the same song. I think that's true of really any art form. It's a shared experience. It's what touches you. So I strive to use my own experiences growing up or dealing with addiction or anything like that to inform and add into this society. And I hope it's enjoyable for everyone, so. I think that's what I got on that subject.
Thank you, Riley. And of course, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Chris. Amazing to have you here today and to be able to share in this discussion. That brings us to, of course, our topic, assimilation. An interesting word, and I was really struck when we were having the conversation about this particular term. And I thought it was something that could bring about some challenging conversation, some enlightenment, as well as like maybe an expanded view on exactly some of the thoughts around this term. But that said, assimilation is as a noun. And I'm going to read through a couple of these definitions, and we had the opportunity in our communications to forward this, and so this is from the Oxford Dictionary, and it's the process of taking in and fully understanding information or ideas. the absorption and integration of people, ideas, or culture into a wider society. Also, the absorption of digestion of food or nutrients by the body or any biological system. And then, of course, the process of becoming similar to something. Very sort of broad strokes, if you will. However, as BIPOC, there is sometimes a different, maybe perhaps, interpretation of this. To go back to an event that happened at the university several years ago, and I promise I'm not name dropping here, but the actor Lily Gladstone, who I think that a lot of people are now starting to become very aware of because of her, shooting into stardom and so forth, was directing a seminar, and she was giving this talk on acting interpretation in response to terminology. She was throwing out various words and asking the people who were participating to physically act out their reactions to these words. And it was a really interesting session. And one of the words that she presented was assimilation. And what was really interesting were the indigenous people that I recognized in the audience all did this kind of a thing, like, get away, right? Unwelcome sort of gestures, if you will. And I saw a lot of the educators and professors in that space with this sort of open arms embrace kind of gesture. And I found that the two of those sort of balanced off of each other was an interesting take. And it was really brilliant in terms of the moment, and what Lily was presenting there was how we react in some of those visceral responses to the language. And so assimilation, that's our word today. And this brings us to our first question, and we're just going to kind of walk through this. This is very much a conversation, and so if an idea pops to your head and you feel like sharing it, please do so. No need to raise hands and so forth. But that said, we'll go to the first question, and I want to start by giving each of you the chance to offer some initial reactions to the term assimilation, and perhaps you could offer some thoughts looking back on how you started to become aware of that term. And I'll open it up, whoever wants to jump in.
I'll start.
Let's do it.
I can tell you that my physical reaction as you're speaking the word assimilation, my heart begins to race. Assimilation is a word in the language of the occupier. And the source, the Oxford Dictionary, is the dictionary of the country that has probably waged, until the United States came along, the most genocidal campaign against the people of the rest of the earth of anybody. So assimilation to me is a very, like I said, my heart is racing, and my past generations had to do everything they could to accept assimilation in hopes that their subsequent generations would not suffer the way they had to. So when I think of my ancestors and what they did in the name of assimilation to kind of hide from it, my heart races because I want to smash the fuck out of it. So when I think of assimilation, it depends on the context in which I'm operating in. So like this Thursday night, I have to go to Bozeman and give a presentation about who the Little Shell tribe are, who the Métis people were are as kind of the preeminent buffalo hunters of the Northern Plains for the better part of a century, that nobody knows about. And I like to remind people right out of the gate that when it comes to the modern context and idea of assimilation, the Europeans in the Hudson's Bay watershed, Rupert's Land, had to assimilate to us first, simply to survive. So for the first 100 years of that interaction, it was Europeans doing everything that we showed them in order to survive. And it wasn't until the church arrives that relationship started to change. So that is what I like to remind people, is assimilation wasn't about us. We helped you adapt our ways so that you could live together with us in this place. So when I say Indinwe Maganadug is all of my relatives, even then we saw these people as our relatives, and we still do. But then one of the other definitions of assimilation is part of me trying to reconnect to so much of what my culture has been lost. So when I spend time, on the riverbank or on the mountains or in the forests, that is me trying to hear the voices of all of those non-human relatives that spoke to my ancestors thousands of years ago, and hope that the message is still there. I know it's still there, and the only way for me to connect to it is to go out where my people did thousands of years ago, because there is nobody left in my community who can pass on that information. The last first language Ojibwe speaker in Montana died of COVID. So we have nobody left in our tribe, in our broader community in Montana who speaks the language fluently, who grew up speaking that language. So that is an example of me trying to assimilate back to the source where everything came from, just like we did when we were first placed on earth. So that is a different spin on assimilation. I've got both sides that I can look at.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that. Who wants to go next?
I'll speak next. My heart also raced, but I think it was more nerves. and I hear and feel what you're saying. And I tend to look at everything, and this was actually part of my mindset coaching work, the universal law of polarity, that everything has good and bad, everything. And I think there's a time and a place, and if I even bring this back to movement, like, what is right in this moment? This gesture was right in that moment. That gesture was right, but I think that the dance is all of the gestures, and when in relationship to another person, and when in relationships that are built on, another universal law is that this universe is abundant, and that all I don't know, but my sense, I know personally, and when I'm watching other people, that when we go into fear, we attack, right? So I just get curious about, how do we start living? It's going to sound so cheeseballs, but with more love. Like in the moment. I love that I need to go like this right now, and that's okay. I love that I need to do this. I love that I don't know right now. And so I think I am curious in this moment about, how do we provide space for all of those feelings? Because when we assimilate, perhaps, all of that, we come to our wholeness, and in wholeness we have integrity. And integrity, we can grow. In integrity, we can let go of what's not serving us. So that feels kind of far away from assimilation. I guess one last thing I'll say, just personally, or as being half Filipino, I know that in the Philippines, like the Filipino culture, from my experience, is really good at blending in. It's almost like you go there and everyone almost seems American in some ways, or like everyone knows American culture. I have a virtual assistant in the Philippines. She knows so much more about American culture than I do, I feel sometimes, or at least pop culture. So that is something in my own personal life, like, I won't say too much about that right now, but I just wanted to put that in the room.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right, that leaves me. Assimilation, ooh, what a word. I guess while it is a word and it has power, the consonants in it sound so aggressive. To assimilate, to me, it's to be forced into something, to become a part, and then the flip of that, right, is like cohesion, to accept, to willingly get into something. I know, for me personally in my life, one of the best moments was I came home from school after experiencing like racism for the first time, or rather prejudice. And my mom looked at me and was like, "You're going to go through things in this life that I can't help you with. I'm not you. I don't have your experience." And that caused me to really take a look at what I wanted my life to be, what these concepts meant to me. Growing up in Billings, Montana, I was always looked at differently, especially after Hurricane Katrina happened, and there was a family that moved up, and everyone was like, Riley, why aren't you more like Marquez? Why don't you dress like Marquez? And I was like, I don't understand what you mean by these concepts of why don't I dress like this or why don't I do this? And I tried it. I tried to be what was expected for a week. And I looked at myself and looked down. I was wearing Echo clothing. I was like, I look stupid. I feel stupid. This isn't who I am. This isn't what I want my life to be. This isn't anything I've ever identified as. And so I don't believe in the concept of assimilation. And I claim my divine right to choose what I want to believe in, to choose what words I accept into my experience. I do believe in the sum parts equal a whole. And I feel that within our world, when we start choosing more and choosing more freedom and choosing these things that touch our hearts and resonate, that's when we begin to build a better society. That's when we start to see these concepts of bipartisanship or prejudice or racism start to fade. Because in my heart, I guess the only thing I ever really identified as was a soul, was a conduit of the universal creation, as an essence of what's behind that and deeper. And so growing up in a system that for my ancestors has capitalized off of their talents, that took these groups of people and brought them over to a different continent and utilized them as labor and paid them in, chicken bones and food and false promises and everything. And then when freedom happened for that group and my ancestors, and we had to decide what our culture was going to be, because that is African American culture in America. It's something that was created. It's something that was based off of these concepts that was then found to be a voice for these people. And then that culture was again enslaved and used. The music was used, the acting was used, and it was used as a tool for making money and influencing other people. And so to me, when I hear assimilation, I hear, I guess, all of the negativity that can be behind that of one group trying to control another. And then I also hear the hope that can be for the future of maybe being a little bit more cohesive and together. I ramble a little bit, not gonna lie, but that's that.
Thank you, Riley. This is a good place to ramble, by the way. The goal, of course, is to be informative. But I mean, at the same time, to layer in that perspective, when you hear the reaction to assimilation, I think our history connected with that word as Indigenous people is one of the first things that comes to mind is the boarding school era. Now that's some of the most recent, I think, in terms of example of a sweeping effort, to sort of bring about these changes or force a behavior on another group or other groups, as it were. I heard in a conversation with Indigenous women the other day that, and I love this terminology, that Indigenous identity is not a monolith, that there is so much diversity throughout, yet there's this attempt to first of all, I think from those history tellers to kind of paint us in that picture first of all, but then to, I guess, move us out of that into what has been codified, I think, historically as civilization, right? And the boarding school is quite cruel in that effect. I think we're right now in an era where we're facing a lot of that reality. A lot of that history is coming to bear, from the bodies to the actual telling of the history and so forth. And so that definitely, I think, impacts, and we heard some of that here today. I think in a more broader meso context, how has your understanding of assimilation impacted your own sense of self within your lifetime? Either trying to be something, and I heard some of that mentioned a little bit, but how did you evolve through the assimilation concept? Because what I'm hearing here on the stage is a lot of self-awareness, a lot of self-identity, a lot of growing into who you are today, both in the creative process and in just your everyday walk of life. I will say this, Riley, when I was coming into the building, I heard Riley walking this way and singing in the street. And your voice, by the way, holy smokes, was echoing off of the buildings. It was just resonating off of things against what I'm used to hearing in this town, which is a kind of silence. And, you know, the busyness of a Sunday downtown Montana cityscape, which oftentimes is music isn't present from the individual in such a loud presentation. And I was so thankful for it in that moment. And I was like, that's got to be Riley. And thank you for this moment. And I figured, dude's going to go get some coffee and we'll be right back. And so I wanted to make mention of that because it was absolutely just an amazing, captivating moment. And I thank you for that. But that said, let's get back to the assimilation thing. Again, how has your understanding of assimilation impacted your own sense of self within your lifetime?
I'll go first on that one. I rebel. I refuse to be categorized or labeled or put into a box to serve some purpose or means other than divine providence. Because honestly, like the boarding school thing, that's so frustrating. That frustrates me so much that a group of anything, individuals or minds can come together and be like, this is what you need to know, this is how this is going to work, and this is where we're going to put you in order to do that. It's absolutely frustrating because it's wrong. And I mean this in this concept of like, oh, right and wrong, right? Positive and negative. It's oppression. It is absolutely stripping individuals of their free will and of their right to choose the life that they want to build and their own personal autonomy, let alone the culture that vanishes. Like I don't. Well, maybe I lived back then in a different life. Like I'm still mad about the burning of the Library of Alexandria. I think that was bullshit. Because we lost knowledge as a collection and a race of cognizant beings upon this earth. We lost knowledge, and so that maybe this is my real feelings around the word assimilation. Is I feel like how we combat that or how we prevent any negative control is authenticity. I strongly believe that everything in the universe, on this planet, in our hearts, our minds, and our souls, is completely 110% authentic. For me, that is from the moment I wake up to the first thoughts in a day. Are those my thoughts, or are those thoughts that are coming from this commercial, or coming from this experience that I had, or something like that, and being conscious and aware of that in every single thing that I do throughout my day is how I strive to break that system, is how I strive to be the most beneficial I can, not only to myself, but everyone around me, because we're all down here together. And I feel that the more humanity starts to understand our genuine authenticity, the more that we're able to come together as a whole to bring what humanity's most authentic creation can be, right? Which is love, which is caring for the earth, which is providing artistic achievements, which is revolutionizing society and changing everything. I think we live in a system in a world that clearly is broken and doesn't work, and we're seeing the result of that, and I feel like people are starting to actually take action. So for me to combat assimilation is just to become the most unique version of myself I can possibly envision and work on that every day.
I want to jump in on that too, because it's funny because I hear you use the word to combat assimilation, but you're essentially doing the Buckminster Fuller thing of like not trying to fix the broken system, but creating a new one, which is yourself. And I think that is actually really key, because we're taught to be just like everyone else, or to be valued because we're like everyone else. And does anyone know what human design is? I'm kind of deep in the study of human design. And so you do, okay. So 70% of this population are manifesting generators. I don't need to go into technicalities, but I'll probably just nerd out. But we get frustrated because we're not doing we're not being who we're designed to be. We're not doing what we're designed to do. So there's that, you know, and I feel like there is a lot of freedom, although there's been so much oppression in someone being a bridge, being like, this is who I am. Let me find this window. I remember reading this interview with, I can't remember if it's Venus or Serena Williams in the New York Times Sunday magazine years ago. And the writer was trying to, she was also a black woman, and asking, you know, she was frustrated, of course. Frustration, when we can't be our true selves, we're frustrated. I'll just say it was, which one was first? Which one won first? Was it Venus? Venus, okay, I think might have been Venus. On what Venus had to go through. And Venus did say this beautiful thing at the end of the article of, I'm a bridge. Like I'm not going to expect there was some other white tennis player who was getting more money, more sponsorship, all those things, but she's like, I'm a bridge. I'm here now in this moment. And it was this beautiful gratitude for what had come before her, and gratitude for the role that she was able to play in this journey. And I just thought it was so gracious. Authenticity, yes, I believe in that fully. And because by nature, we are biological creatures that are attracted to life. We are attracted to anything that is life-giving. So authenticity, whether or not we're conscious of it now in this lifetime, we actually are drawn to it. Even though social media can turn us into lemmings and think you're supposed to do it like this or sound like this or wear this thing, like, I think there's always going to be a subcurrent. We have to go through those stages of being lemmings, you know, but there's a subcurrent that I think is just part of our biological nature that is asking us over time, because it's evolution, what is true? And again, we have to, like, if I look at my own personal life, it's like, okay, yeah, I had to do all that stuff. I had to try to dress a certain way. I'm doing it today without even knowing it. You know, I'm trying to assimilate. And I think it's just a fascinating journey to look at what is that truth. You know, I was raised in a pretty white environment. And we had like, the Filipinos were coming this weekend. That was on my mom's side of the family. The Boules are coming this weekend. So I had that, and I knew like Filipino culture. It's like there's gonna be a lot of food. We're gonna laugh a lot. But my Boule family was like that too. You know, just different. But I didn't really have to. And a woman said to me, she's like, well, that's privilege, Michelle. I didn't really have to identify as Asian American, except for in 6th grade, maybe, when we had to do the cultural background thing and I showed up in my Filipino outfit. Or in 4th grade, when this kid turns around and looks at me and he's like, he turns around in the desk, he's like, are you black? And I was like, I don't know. I really didn't know, because my mom, her skin's like your skin color, you know? And I was like, am I black? And then, you know, going to Germany and getting the little boys doing this to my sister and me when we were in high school. And then starting to be told, oh, Michelle, now you can apply for this grant because you're BIPOC. And I remember these young women I was teaching once at the American Dance Festival in New York, and they came up to me. They're both African-American women. They're like, we don't want to apply for grants that talk about our black experience. We just want to make dances. So I think it's an interesting lens sometimes when we lead, like, when do we lead with this? When do we let it go? And again, I think there's time and place. Am I complete? Yes, that's it.
I'm not dressed to assimilate, I just get sweaty. So I'm dressed to not be sweaty. Because the last talk I did, I got really sweaty and I was kind of embarrassed. And I don't know if that's a thing about assimilation or not. I just don't like feeling that way. So
Sounds like your truth.
It is my truth, yeah. So when I think about my relationship to assimilation, the word that comes to me is responsibility. Because I am quite possibly of the first generation who do not have to feel that we have to assimilate or die in the way that as recently as my dad's generation, not so much when he was an adult, but certainly as adolescent or into high school or even into his early 20s, was in a situation where in certain places around the country, it was a mortal threat to be in the wrong place at the wrong time as an Indigenous person. So I feel a responsibility towards those ancestors who had to assimilate, who had to choose to live a certain way beyond what they didn't want to just to survive. I don't have to do that. So I feel a responsibility to take the knowledge of that, which is not history. I mean, it's not ancient history. It's recent history. So when we talk about boarding schools where Native kids were taken and, kill the Indian, save the man, that was the mantra of the very first one, this Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. They were still operating into the 90s in Canada. And when you think of other elements of Indigenous lifeways, it wasn't until 1978 that we were allowed to speak our language or practice our cultural ceremonies. So like when you see in a couple weeks when the powwow happens up on the reservation over the 4th of July weekend, tribes started scheduling ceremonies around the 4th of July because they could mask it as an American celebration, when in reality, it was the only way that we could gather and engage with our relatives and practice our traditions in a way that we could say was one thing while it was actually another. So 1978, I already had a stack of KISS records by 1978. There was probably a Village People record or two in there too, probably that Rumors record by Fleetwood Mac, I think, was slid in there somewhere. So yes, that is recent. So, like if I sit with an elder, or if any of us sit with an elder, and we learn from them, they deliver a teaching to us. It is a responsibility, and that's not just an Indigenous thing, it's all of us. We have a responsibility to take that teaching out into the world and share with other people. And if we don't, that is just wrong. It's just wrong. It's just hoarding for your own use. So I have spent the last decade learning where my people came from, trying to understand why my dad chose to address him as an Indigenous person was fighting words. He wanted no part of that. And his father was the same way. Yet my grandmother would talk openly about how we were Chippewa. And as a kid, for me, that was just one of those weird things that adults just did weird. And it didn't really mean anything until I went to my grandfather's funeral in 1995. And the whole church is full of obvious presenting Indian people. And I was dumbstruck by the visual reckoning of where I come from. And my dad kind of elbowing me, what do you think of all those Indians? He said we weren't related to any of the other Latrés in Montana. The seminal Latré in Montana was a guy named Mose Latré, who was part of the 25 families of Métis, Red River Métis, who came down from the Milk River and founded the town of Lewistown, Montana. It was originally a Métis settlement. Mose and Susie, his wife, who was a Assiniboine, had like 19 kids. And from those 19 kids came how many grandkids and how many great-great-grandkids. So I absolutely assure you, I am related to every single Latré in Montana. They all come from that one place and spread throughout. So that for me was why. Why did my dad feel that way? Why did my grandfather feel that way? And just peeling back, this is a tired metaphor, but the layers of the onion, of where we came from and why my dad did not feel the pride he should feel about what we achieved and the things that our ancestors survived to make it possible for me to be on this stage and tell you of people that maybe you've never even heard about. How many people here have heard the word Métis or know what I'm talking about when I say Métis? That's an unusual number. I go to Lewistown and I say, how many of you folks are Métis? Nobody raises their hand. How many of you folks have lived here for more than 3 or 4 generations? 3/4 of the room raise their hand. It's like you people are all, I almost called you effers, are all Métis people in one way or the other. So that for me is what assimilation represents. It's a responsibility to speak the truth to the power that is assimilation, which is a tool of genocide, which is ongoing.
Thank you for that, Chris. I think that's really important. Some of those, the views that we're hearing, just from our own experiences and relationships, I think, with some of these concepts. And when I think of assimilation, particularly when in my Indigenous studies, in that space, and by the way, that was rough. I mean, being an Indigenous person in an Indigenous studies environment is exposure to a lot of historical trauma, generations and generations, and across that diversity and so forth, such a similar story that happening to these varied people and so forth. And the Cherokee were no different in terms of the impact. We have all heard of the Trail of Tears, but as you think about those communities, the Cherokee were some of the earliest Indigenous to really assimilate. Slave owners, though not every Cherokee was a slave owner. There was this move to imitate and become part of this massive culture that was moving in, right? We've got to assimilate to survive was some of the philosophy during that time. And ultimately what happened, even in that early space, is those people eventually were reviled despite adopting the life ways, the business practices, the language, the clothing. It caused tremendous disruption between the community that they came from. Eventually, the more traditional people murdered those who signed away the treaties and so forth. There was some brutal reality that came out of some people who wanted to assimilate, others who adhered to more traditional ways. And so when I think about assimilation and as a word, one thing that comes to mind in a more modern context is resentment. It seems that no matter how well you adopt or bring about these behaviors or an identity, something about us, shabing, stands out and apart from that. And I think that that's where we start really getting into the racial context of this conversation and sort of this modern identity of racism and so forth. Is we oftentimes adhere. I work in higher education. I advise students. I oversee people. I manage. I dress the part. I speak the words as if, and with a granular breakdown, have delved into the terminology and the words of the English language, so I can have a mastery of it and a command to operate in those spaces. And yet, oftentimes, how I hear us referred to in these spaces is, oh, that's a troublemaker. It's that voice to represent a modicum of social justice and to bring about a kind of awareness, or to educate and teach, communicate some of these tensions. Oftentimes there is a resentment that comes with it, which pushes and builds mistrust. And so I guess let's talk about that a little bit, and I'm going to put that to our panelists. Have you in your experience ever witnessed, saw, interacted with, or have this sense of the resentment piece that I'm talking about?
Resentment on, can you just
resentment of us for assimilating, for becoming, for participating. Is it good enough ever? Is it criticized? I'll put it in another way. There was a recent conversation in a political sphere. They were actually in the house of a state government, and one peer looked at the other, by the way, a lesser educated man, a white man, speaking to a black man, and putting the words to him, and somebody, I can see some expressions going, oh yeah, that crap. Saying to him, well, how is it for you as a black person? How do you feel about, like, basically getting, and I'm paraphrasing, getting into college on an athletic scholarship, or because of, you know, this push to be more inclusive kind of a thing? And the guy's reaction was like, what the hell? It's like, I was like tier 2, man. I was like up with the smart people. I worked my way into that space. And so having that sort of, and that's to me an expression of that resentment and that way of saying, I'm not even going to acknowledge how deserving and hardworking you are. I'm going to talk about it in terms of white people giving you an advantage to lift you up kind of narrative. Does any of this translate in terms of your understanding of assimilation or your interaction with the reality of it?
So, I wouldn't say I necessarily feel resentment. I feel sorrow. Feel sorrow that due to a lack of education and acceptance and striving to understand differences in culture, that groups of people are oppressed. That groups of individuals are misunderstood, that they're categorized, and that they're forced to feel this awkward tension to then become something that they're not, that we're not. Like there's no point in history for the entire human race except for maybe like deep primordial cultures that everyone was the same. It's a falsity. The thing that unites everyone it's blood. It's our shared experience of life, of consciousness. And everything other than that is completely unique and individualized. And that's the magic of it. That's the beauty of existence. That's the beauty of the stars and the planets. It's all a different combination of experiences and chemicals and thoughts and life. And so when I hear about like a situation like that or an interaction between folks where there's ignorance, it brings pain to my heart to know that there is a degree of separation that now exists because one side was maybe unwilling to understand the other or unable to cross that bridge through communication. That's a changeable issue. That's what's really sad to me is it's workable. Is it doesn't have to exist like this. One of my least favorite things to hear in the world is, well, we can't do that. I don't believe in can'ts. All right, I'm an American. There's my joke for the day. I'm a human. We're growing, evolving beings that constantly are learning. And to say that we can't do something is to admit defeat and failure. And nothing, absolutely nothing in creation operates off of we can't do that. Sure, science has laws and there's certain degrees of separation between everything, but there's a way to make everything work. And yeah, it really brings sorrow to my heart, especially to hear like as a black man. That's one of my favorite things. Well, as a black man, tell me about your views of this. Like, hey, how about as Riley, as someone who went to the American education system, who was expelled from school, who, spent some time in prison and was houseless and on the streets. Like, why don't we talk about our experiences as beings rather than the things that we're perceived as? And I think as long as we continue to have that degree of separation of perception, we're always going to be pulled into this system of assimilation that clearly doesn't want to understand people's different points of view. Why would it? That's threatening to the system that exists. Systems of fear and control operate off of fear and control and oppression, and they want everything to assimilate into it because that's how the structure can continue to exist.
But it actually won't, because as we homogenize, we're eradicating our diversity. Like we can see that in our planet, right? Like we don't have any more. My dad always says this at home in Illinois, like there's no more worms out on the street after rain. There's less like I don't even know what I jumped from to this. but we can't homogenize, and I think this is like this thing of your uniqueness is your gift. Like you're Riley, you happen to be what do you want to call yourself? Like I'm Michelle, I happen to be. This is when I started having, and yes, a point of privilege. I started being asked to lead my identity as something that it was fluid for me, being raised biracially too. It was, and then it was like, wait, now I'm Filipino. Oh, what does that mean? Like, okay, and yeah, so I just feel like there's like boundaries, limits, boundaries, we need those. Like, by definition, we need those for safety. Like, that's how far the stage is. I'm not going to leap past that. And then when is it functional and when is it dysfunctional? If that's not too abstract. You know, like, can a boundary just be a step that then maybe it dissipates? Like, you know, that those things when the person's walking up the stairs and all the stairs disappear behind it? I don't know. Like, that to me sounds truly in the moment. I'm going to use this now. Do I need to hold on to this? And I, as a dancer, I feel this in an embodied way. Like, I know if something is held with tension, yeah, like that can let me jump higher, perhaps. But if I hold that tension as I jump, like I need it for a moment, when I have to let it go in the action too. So I get curious about our bodies being fluid, the experience of that. Am I holding my breath? Like, and I think these things that don't have integrity, like even, you know, with I'm just gonna go here. Everything about germs, like we've become a culture since Louis Pasteur, like get rid of the germs, but we're killing ourselves. You know, so how do we allow for diversity with boundaries and clarity? Every cell has a boundary. We're not meant to be boundaryless, but in the moment, according to a function, what is needed? And what if the function that we want is connection, even with a boundary, or understanding with a boundary? Because I'm not you right now. Am I? I don't know. Like, you know, I'm not.
I'm starting to wonder a little bit.
I am too, actually. I'm wondering also. You know, I mean, that, like, where are we gonna go? Let's go into the Matrix. But you know, it's like in this moment, we need definition now. What do we need now?
To answer your original question about resentment, I have certainly encountered that, like when I go out and I do public speaking events and I remind people about stolen land or all of the things that have happened on this continent as it relates to, you know, settlers and indigenous people. And sometimes the feedback I get is, you're just trying to make me feel guilty. It's like, no, I'm just trying to make sure everybody understands the context that we're beginning from. We don't move forward without understanding where we started. And that doesn't mean that I'm trying to go back and make you feel guilty for a bunch of shit that people, you know, 5 generations ago did. But if you come at me saying, well, I'm a 5th generation Montanan, I say, well, that just means that your ancestor was more likely directly related to the bloody taking of mine for themselves. So I'm not trying to make anybody feel guilty. I'm just trying to make people understand why we think and feel the way we feel. But I also get resentment from my own people because there's all kinds of political shit that goes on in the indigenous community too. So like I might say, well, let's talk about education. I agree that education is important, but where is that education coming from? So there are elements in the indigenous community that want to bludgeon those of us who don't have advanced education with their doctorates and their advanced university education. And I usually like to say, nothing says decolonize like a PhD, and I say that with irony, because most of that comes from an institution that has been a player in the ongoing genocide for the last 500 years. So let's level that playing field too, and understand that there's a lot of valid education that happens out in the house or in the teepee during powwow that has nothing to do with higher education, higher institutional education. Or I might tell my indigenous relatives that if you are a proponent of blood quantum rules within your tribe, you're actively participating in the long-term genocide of your own people. Because blood quantum is false. It's fake. Any of these blood things, like how much Indian are you? I'm Anishinaabe from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet. And I believe all of you are Anishinaabe from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet. Because in Anishinaabe cosmology, we believe we are all Anishinaabe. So the first person created was created by Kichi Manitou, our creator. They recognize that the world that has everything on it already is lacking one thing. He realizes that it's the first person. So Kichi Manitou takes a handful of soil from each of the 4 directions, places it in a shell, and breathes through that shell, and what emerges from the other side is the first person. So that is why we believe, and everybody springs from that first person. So we are all Anishinaabe. What makes us different is how we have to live culturally within the environment that we're placed. So my Blackfeet relatives and the non-human relatives that they have to interact with in order to survive in their landscape is vastly different from what my Filipino relatives have to interact with and what they need to do and how they have to live in the place they are, which is different from my Navajo relatives, which is different from our Chinese relatives, and what is different from our sub-Saharan relatives. So we are all Anishinaabe. We are just interacting with our environment different based on what that environment is. So it becomes these cultural differences. And this is a revelation that came to me from a pack of smelly fourth graders a couple of years ago, teaching poetry on the reservation as part of the Missoula Writing Collaborative. Which I should mention, if you have time, our long-term executive director, Carolyn Patterson's retirement party is at the library starting at 5 o'clock if you want to go thank her for the work she's done in sending writers out to elementary schools to teach writing to kids. And I threw a prompt out with nothing planned as to what I thought was going to come back at me. And I said, if someone was going to make a movie about your life, or they were going to write a book about your life, what are the key things that need to be in that story to represent what is important to you in your life? And I gave them 12 minutes or whatever, and they're all writing away, and almost universally what they came back. I mean, there was the average kid who said chicken nuggets, or Fortnite, woo. But almost universally, they came back with like, my friends, my family, my pets, my home. All of these things that if you go all the way back to when Wayne Abuju first popped out of the shell on the other side of Kichi Manitou's, breath, what was important? What did we need to survive? We needed our family, or we were going to die. If we couldn't work with our family, we were going to die. If we didn't have friends to help us survive, we were going to die. If we didn't have a place to live, we were going to die. If we didn't have our animal companions, whether it's the food we eat or the wolf sharing the fire in the cave mouth with us, all of those things are universal, again, to all of us as people, no matter who we are or where we come from. So I think that speaks kind of what you guys are saying is it's the recognition of what is really important to us as people, and that very thin sliver of the powerful who's in the best interest to keep us poking at each other for stupid shit. And that's what it comes down to, is all the time we spend poking each other for stupid shit rather than working together on these just handful of things that is really all we need to interact and live with love and community and joy and everything. That's my rant. And I'm sweaty, despite my best efforts.
I just want to add something on to that, because I coach a lot of people to make more money, artists to make more money. And it's getting nuanced, because it's like, we need to keep removing, something you said at the very end there, it's like, what is it for you? Not everyone is designed to live off of this much money per month or that much money per month. Like, what is it to you? Not everyone is born to be the president, it's like, or to be a neuroscientist. Like, there's not, I had a woman, she used to just come to my free workshops, and she's like, Michelle, now I spend time in the garden. She's like, I'm a 7-year cancer survivor. I spend time in the garden. I listen to what I want. She's like, this is my legacy for my grandchildren. She's not out there like trying to make a big business and do all this stuff. So I feel like there's a deconditioning in this process of what is true. And I feel like we've been brainwashed to think, like, to assimilate in a certain way towards a truth that is not our own. And that can be racial, cultural, but it's like, it's individual design. If you're a bumblebee, don't pretend you're an eagle, and neither is better or worse than the other. And I think there's that too. It's like, we're afraid if we're not this, then what? Like, I was raised, I didn't learn Tagalog. It's now called Filipino. You know, because my mom came here and she's never really said this to me, but it was hard to show up and not speak the language. They don't have she, he. She still gets her and she and he confused, you know? And so that was my like little path of assimilation too, was like, and I was a good student. Like that was my assimilation, but is that functional now? Is it functional now in the ways that I'm trying to grow? So I think I'm throwing a lot in here, but it just coming back to the moment. And where did I start with you?
Well, you were talking about coaching people and money, and that is something like 2 days ago I was on an online Zoom panel talking about growing your newsletter audience and growing your income. And I felt like every question they asked, like, well, how do you market yourself? Well, I don't, because I'm trying to embrace enough.
Yeah.
And that's what we run into, is the idea that we have to be growing everything all the time. And I'm like, enough for me. I mean, literally, in Ojibwe, our word for thank you is miigwech. Chi miigwech is thank you very much. But that word didn't originally mean thank you. What it meant was enough. So like in trade negotiations, I am bringing in a pile of beaver pelts and you're giving me metal pots or knives or whatever it is that we're trading, and it's coming back and forth, and finally I say miigwech, which means enough. You've given me what I feel is the value for what I am giving you. And ultimately, because as that word became adopted by the European, they thought we were saying thank you, because that's how you close a transaction from their mindset, was to say thank you. So miigwech in our language just evolved as thank you, when in reality it's enough. And enough is, I think, an important thing to embrace sometimes, rather than be disappointed with more, right? Because you didn't get more.
And it relates to the boundary, right? Like, enough of this energy coming to me. I mean, literally, I'm going to share something personal. I was doing some unexpected trauma work, and what came up was being a baby on my mom, and like the words were "not now," "not now" to everyone else in the room. "Not now. Don't touch her. Not now. Enough." It feels like the same thing, you know. And we've all had experiences where we have not been taught what's enough, from money to attention to what we give. Right? Like when we give from a place of fear, it's like, no, that's enough of that. And I feel like we only know this through lived experience. So culturally also, it's interesting because I feel gratitude for the history, right? Like we wouldn't be where we are today without all the things that have happened. And I'm trying to tie this into enough somehow. But it's, again, like I don't. This is surprise. It's like, what is the porous boundary? When? And the enough is it's only my truth. You might be like, bring it on, and I'll be like, no, that's enough for me, right? But I feel like there is a space in the design where these things work together, when we're not trying to force everyone else to understand our own enoughness.
That so many things that were shared. Especially around like the concept of enough, right? And assimilation, and what you're saying about the bumblebee can't be the eagle, nor can the eagle be the bumblebee, right? I feel it's so integral to us as beings in our society that we do the things that we're here to do, and the only individual who knows to do that is the individual, like kids. I will always refer back to this, is children will wake up and go to their parents and be like, I want to be a fireman. And it's like, why? I don't know. It's what I want to do. And then throughout our lives, we get told, no, you need to do this. No, you need to get straight A's. No, you need to become a doctor so you can have lots of money, so that you can be successful, so that you can be fulfilled. And none of that will ever fulfill that soul wound, that integral need for enoughness, for having what we know we need to do. I am a huge proponent of the idea that if we actually educated children based off of what they felt they wanted to do, that there would be enough lawyers and doctors and firemen and peace officers, keyword peace, and artists and all these other facets that make up our society, because it would be driven by the individual. It would be driven by the soul. It would be driven by the heart and the mind, rather than assimilating into a system that is based off of greed and fear and lack, which is contrary to natural law, which is love and abundance and trust. It's our culture, it's our society. We live in this world where it's like, well, you need this to be happy, and you need this to be happy, and you need this to be happy, which is based out of this conquistador mentality of, I will take what I want, I will take what you have so that I have enough to never have to live without it. And the irony of that is how many people are actually able to live in that vein of thought, because that vein of thought serves those who already have abundance, where ironically most of them got it from many, many, many generations ago. And it continues to propagate this system of lack and fear. And it's just false. It's a false reality that most, if not everyone, is forced to live in, because we're assimilated into this. We're taught this from a very young age. So let's freaking break it. I'm all about breaking that cycle.
I want to back up what you said about children choosing what they want to do with your lives, because like I write a newsletter called An Irritable Métis, because my first response to just about everything is irritation. And as you were speaking, I was reminded, I haven't thought of this in a long time, of like one of the first memories I have of just feeling really indignant. And there was somebody, I don't know if my mom remembers this, she's in the audience. I think it was my dad's like Navy commander or something was visiting and was asking him, you know, what his kids wanted to do. And I'm standing right there and, you know, with their lives. And my dad, you know, gestures to me and says, well, he's still not beyond the policeman and fireman age, you know, when little kids wanted to be a policeman or a fireman. And I was so pissed because I was already determined at that point that I was going to be a rock star. And that's just to bolster your point, because I literally was like outraged where I wanted to grab this guy by the shirt and say, hey, he's wrong. So yes, let children decide.
Very nice. I've really just sort of let that go because there was so much pouring out of your communications. One thing that like I think overall that I was hearing throughout, and it just actually kind of got me thinking about, was the language we speak, the words we're using, where we source that material, and what it informs us about who we are. And when we talk about the racial conversation and the terminology black, white, red, etc., right? Those are not our words. Those are not concepts that come from us. We didn't identify white people. That's not our word. That's not self-imbued. It is one of those things that for a post-colonial America, the language came in along with the teachings and so forth, along with the assimilation. And so it wasn't, hey, I'm black. It's, you are black. And here's what that means. By the way, here's the rules to that. You'll see that there's more rules for you than this guy over here, right? And so that's kind of, I think, for me, something I think really heavily about when we have these conversations about race, about racial identity, about gender equity, about the assimilation piece, and we're going to go into some other terms as we go through the rest of the summer. And this is really what makes this such an important conversation, I think, because we really have to boil it down to its simplest parts and start looking about how we relate into a world that is largely put upon. And I think we all sort of have some relationship to that every time we leave the house. What am I going to put on? Who am I going to impress? What do I get? Am I going to have the right words? Right? There's some level of that thinking. And layered into that BIPOC experience is, first of all, do it like us so that I'm comfortable in the room. Speak to me in this English language that I can understand and on my level so I can be comfortable. And if you take any part of that and adjust it in a way that honors our lineage, our heritage, which, by the way, predates any concept of race or racism, used to be just those people over there. But that said, those things that we layer into our identities now, that's where we start to sort of taste that resentment, where it's like, it's not good enough. Go back to where you came from. An interesting thing to hear in the state of Montana when you're Native American is go back to where you came from, because it offers rife opportunity for some humor in your response. That's sort of a test of our resilience. It's like, I don't always turn to anger in those responses. Sometimes I'm a real smartass when it comes to those things. But that said, that's the part of this reality of understanding the very word that we're talking about today, assimilation, is do it, but don't do it better. And if you do, understand that you're taking advantage of the system somehow to get that. You're either not doing enough or you're being showy about it. And just knock it off and go back to where you came from. Be here, make me feel comfortable. And if you're going to be you, do it over there where I don't have to look at it or hear it. So.
Yeah, it's so codependent. It's like, I think we probably all know this. Anyone here free of codependence? Probably nobody, right? We're putting our, I think both ways, how do we work with that? Putting our happiness, our satisfaction in someone else's hands. And I think it's interesting to see, like, okay, this person is maybe uncomfortable with what I'm asking for. It's also not my job. How can I have compassion with a boundary in relationship to this? But I feel like, and this is my design too, like I think everything we need is inside of us. Like those inner dynamics. I had a teacher 10 years ago say this to me, like, I don't know why she would do this work to help people break through their limiting belief system. She's like, I don't know why people tell me they're bored. She's like, every single day is like a mythological, like you ask your partner for something and they shun you or whatever, and it's like then whatever, I don't know, Zeus or something rises up, it's just like, it's happening all the time. So it's just, I think it's fascinating to look at where really is the freedom. Like where is the freedom that goes beyond condition? Because I feel like when we start creating that freedom that goes beyond condition, we start to create new kinds of conditions. If that makes sense. It's like, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, Indigenous people in this country are not new to assimilation, just in terms of the definition that we saw. In fact, when Christianity came around, there were many Indigenous people going into those spaces saying, that's some good medicine they got going on over there. Clearly it's serving them well. How do I get me a piece of that, right? Those were some of the concepts. Take what's good. Take what's healthiest for your community. Build it in. That's how we eventually were forced to live together, so there was some of that coming together and living more as one. But prior to that we were very much looking to our surroundings to bring on different ways and so forth, to benefit from and so forth. So it wasn't always forced. But I think what we're talking about now in a modern context is, of course, this relationship to how it exists now. And so just to really quick put a question out there, because we are coming up to the end of the actual presentation piece and moving on to Q&A. And so just really quickly here, I did want to throw out, I wanted to make sure to get this question in. And oftentimes we look to our Indigenous people, our brown people, et cetera, to help educate us, right? Can you help me not offend you? Oftentimes is how it's sometimes received. But that said, perhaps in reaching out to the panelists here, perhaps you can offer the folks in the audience and the group here and the community and those who are sponsoring this event a thought on how our local community and organizations can do their part to create pathways to understanding around these kinds of factors, what kinds of awareness and so forth. Any thoughts on that? moving forward.
A society grows great when humans plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. Is one of my favorite proverbs. Education. Educate the next generation. It begins with us. Educate yourself. And we live in a really great community, right? There's so many wonderful nonprofits and organizations and human beings who live here that are so dedicated to bettering themselves and bettering the lives of everyone around them. And so continuing that trend, right, it's a very internal process. My reactions to things that's a me thing. That's my process. That's my experiences. That's my perception. That's my reality coming into contact with a different energy and trying to understand it and trying to grow from it. And so dedicating our own lives to understanding ourselves and understanding how we think and act and respond to external stimuli and understanding our own internal stimuli, and then teaching that to the next generation and continuing this web and network of growth is how we instigate massive world and societal change. Like I wish I could sit here and be like, we're gonna fix it in 10 years. It's not gonna happen. 20, yeah, we might start see some of these seeds sprout. 30, that would be really rad. 500 years for sure. I strongly believe, and maybe even sooner. I'm not the creator, I'm not in charge of time. I just feel strongly in my heart that with the work we do on a daily basis to understand these concepts, to understand these precepts, and to see what doesn't work and see what does work and begin putting that into our own lives and teaching other folks and individuals to do the same, especially younger generations, that's how we see change. That's how we see a world of love and a society of growth and prosperity, is it begins with us and it carries on with every generation that comes afterwards.
Thank you.
I'll go next. I mean, what you said, the proverb that you dropped on us, which is a great one, is similar to the 7 generations, which most of us know of, the Haudenosaunee Iroquois idea that whatever decision we make, we have to think of the ramifications of 7 generations from us. What does this mean to them? And recently in that conversation, there's come to be a different idea of what that means, where it's still 7 generations, but we are in the middle one. So we think of, what am I about to do? How would the people for the previous 3 generations think of that? And what effect is it going to have on the next 3? Which for me is a little easier to wrap my head around, because I can imagine who those people 3 generations ago were and who those people 3 generations from now might be. Because it's not that far. I could potentially have, if I'd started having children a little younger and all of that, and if they'd had children, it's not unusual to know someone that many generations removed from yourself, or someone that many generations previous to you. So it's an easier way to kind of visualize that concept. But as far as like how do our local people, I don't know about organizations. I think organizations, you have individuals. And as individuals, I'd like to quote the great prophet Rocky Balboa from the first Creed movie, when he told Adonis Creed, if you're talking, you're not listening. If you're talking, you're not listening. And that's when I have problems with the people who think it's my responsibility to educate them to treat me better, is shut the fuck up then. Let me talk. Right? Because if you're so busy trying to explain everything that you're doing that's right, you're not giving me any opportunity to suggest that maybe you went awry a little bit, or maybe you might rethink this thing, or maybe someone a lot wiser than me has some truth that they can share with you that you're not going to hear if you're talking. And that's on me too, right? I mean, it's not just a one-way thing, because we all are coming from places of trauma. We all have generations of things that we're struggling with that are inside us, whether it's related to the genocide of North America or not. That happened. We're here. We're right now, as you've been talking about. Let's recognize that we have all of that, and then let's listen to each other, figure out a way to move forward with it.
Yeah, and I would add to this, one thing I feel is that we're so afraid to not know in a moment what to do. Like, I remember used to work with this choreographer, Deborah Hay. She's in her 80s, and we'd be on tour, and she'd be like, oh, I don't know what that word means, like in a Q&A. what does that word mean? And I was like, wow, how cool. Her ego is not tied up. False fear-based ego in the fact that she should know, right? So I feel like sometimes those questions, they come from fear, right? Like, I guess I'm just curious about addressing that. Like, what do you want to be called right now? Because, when Joseph said, well, here's the handout, here's the rules, how long do those rules stay true? Nothing, like everything has changed. Like that's the truth that we have. So I know that's a fear-based ego thing. When are you enough? Well, when you do this and this and this, well then what's it going to be after that? But I think there's some, I would just want to embrace within ourselves, like, I don't know what to do here. I don't know. Can you help me? Like, what can we find together that's greater than the two of us? Like that, because that's so creative. Like that, when I talk about, I'm like, that feels more fun than trying to figure out, like, what do we put here that's the right thing that's going to make everybody feel okay. Like, and I think as artists, I think that's something we can do that take us beyond that current paradigm, or keep reminding us there's another space that is speaking to something that we know to be true, but we haven't gotten there yet. And we may never in this lifetime, right? Like you were saying, who knows? Actually, maybe it already is here. We're just blind to it. And then, you have a moment when you see it for a second. Like, thank God for artists. We can see it for, more seconds.
You better write it down then, though, because you'll forget it if you don't.
Wow. This actually has been definitely a red letter date in my mind in terms of these conversations. Your STFU comment actually came up last summer during a conversation where we had to eventually tell someone to please listen and maybe not rob the room of so much oxygen. I think we're really fortunate, particularly in this day and time and in this community for sure. This venue, the folks in this space, to be having this conversation and to have the ability to listen to these talented folks sitting next to me here, and I certainly do for sure. And we're going to turn it over to Q&A here because I really want to give you, the audience, the opportunity to ask questions and join into this conversation a little bit. I encourage your curiosity. I encourage your willingness to speak to us up here on the stage with your curiosity. But before we break to do that, I really kind of want to just take a minute in honoring these folks on stage to just give the mic here really quickly and briefly about what's coming up, what's next, what's happening in your life, what's going on with the creativity. With Chris, we have these I had placed over here, and I think what I put in the email was in fine bookstores everywhere. But I think Fact and Fiction, you'll be able to carry, or they carry these volumes, and please check them out. Really invite everyone here to participate in the creativity and the genius that you see here on stage. And I say that with all humility, of course, because it takes a lot of heart to produce this kind of work and then to put yourself out to the world with our creativity. So Chris, let's start with you. What's next?
The most exciting thing I'm involved, well, I've got a book coming out next year, and if you're still around here, you'll hear about it, Becoming a Little Shell. It's about this past decade of figuring out who I am and where I come from and who my people are and where we come from, all of that stuff. But kind of the most exciting thing I'm involved with right now is last summer I was invited to Yellowstone Park to represent the Little Shell tribe. It was called Yellowstone Remembered. It was the first time as part of their 150-year anniversary that the tribes, who were there all along but got chased out when it became a national park, were invited back, and we had a teepee encampment set up, and we were there just talking to people, and that was awesome. And then just this past week, I got invited next week to go back to Yellowstone with a bunch of other Indigenous people and a bunch of Park Service brass to gather in kind of a summit and talk about what else do we need to do to enhance the education about public lands and the national parks and the Indigenous role. And to me, that is really exciting because that's a step towards inviting us back into spaces that we never wanted to leave in the first place. So I'm really excited about that.
I'm currently an artist in residence at Montana Open Air, and on June 27th, I believe, Tuesday, I'll be doing a presentation there at Moon Randolph Homestead, if you want to join for that. I'm part of COHESION, so I'll be participating in our events throughout the year. This week, I'm starting a 5-week program with a cohort of creatives called the Brilliant Creative, which is my coaching and healing work to help people like find their truth, this essence of what we're talking about, and how to bring it into the world in a way that feels aligned. And I'm just making things. I don't always know where they're going to land. Photos, videos, an evening-length performance when I feel the time is right, not because I feel like to be a successful artist, I have to have checked off all these boxes. So I'm really in a practice of listening to that. And from that practice, my theme I've been working with at Moon Randolph through Montana Open Air is on coming home. Because I did step away from my creative practice for some time as I was studying business and studying the universal laws and studying what is spiritual prosperity. So I'm in a phase where I'm curious about, okay, how is this, what is the next creative step? I'm not going to do it because I lived in New York City for 21 years and I had to get out of that in some ways, like, because there's so much conditioning there. There's loud voices everywhere, like if you're a human with an open head. But that's what I'm curious about. I can't make any promises of what I'll be making beyond what I just said, but I hope to connect with some of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, other than trying to transcend the mortal shell, always. Just kidding, I'm very, very stoked to be alive. No, I'm not really. Like, hey, I'm ready, beam me up. So I have a couple different projects in the works, equally experienced the compulsion of I have to create. If I don't, I will start making shit up in my head and turning it inward. It's absolutely a nightmare. I think that's the curse and the blessing of every artist. If I can't make stuff with these or my hands or my experiences, I will make it up about reality. So I have a show coming up at Monk's on the 20th. I'll be opening up for my son Hurricane, which is an amazing 12-piece live horn section hip hop group. And then I'll be playing here at the Zach on the 25th with Rob Travolta. I've actually been telling people it's the 26th. I need to maybe go fix that. And then other than that, over the course of winter, I created a short film called Wanderer that is also attached to a music video. I'm in the process of finalizing the screening of that. So when you start seeing billboards and stuff pop up, please come see this film locally at Hot Springs, Montana. And it's a project that's really near and dear to my heart as it talks about love and the acceptance of love and then the absence of that love and coming to terms with what does that thought process look like. And it's loosely based off of The Shining because Symes Hotel looks very rad and very much like the Overlook to me. And then other than that, just creating as much as I possibly can. I'm finalizing a lot of stuff for my second EP, Love and Luck. So that'll be out in the music verse. I guess that's the unfortunate side of being a musician. Look at you because you know. Is my ability to create is based off of the equipment that I have, and my ability to afford that equipment is based off of my jobs and the gigs that I play, and my ability to book those gigs is based off of my social media following. So here's my shameless plug. If you follow me on Instagram, Riley James Music 13, or Facebook, Riley James Music, you can do all the updates. And other than that, I will be running around town and probably singing. And please don't hesitate to say hello. I very much love this community and would love to get to know everyone, and just share that connection of humanity. So, yeah.
Marvelous. Thank you so much. And as an audience, thank you. Let's put our hands together for these lovely panelists today. Yes, indeed. Let's, of course, all do our part to support local artists and local art, and our BIPOC community. Let's be welcoming and patience, of course, with everyone's frustration around many of these topics and so forth. And let's listen. I think that's a big part of it. So moving forward, let's get into the Q&A piece of this. Let's get the conversation moving in the larger space here. And I think we're all pretty audible. So if you're able to shout it out, raise a hand, we'll do this and point and hopefully get you. But who wants to start us off? We got a hand up over here.
I'm not very loud, so can you hear me?
I can always shout out the gist of the question.
Yeah, I was wondering how much of assimilation is not being white, but like going with the stereotypes that white people see in your culture. Like, how do you think you take that on yourself, or how do you react when other people request that of you?
Yeah, taking on board the maybe the tropes or some of the more commercial. The tomahawk chop comes to mind. Anybody have a response to that?
So as someone incarnated in the body of a black man, growing up, it's, are you going to be an athlete or a rapper? The irony is that, yes, I do make music and I can rap, and I was pretty good at sports. It's more a direct result of my parents putting me in piano lessons and also causing me to do sports, and less with the color of my skin. And so that's like always the interesting thing, that anytime someone is like, oh, well, you must be good. I think the common joke is like, oh, well, if we play basketball, Riley's going to be slam dunking. And yeah, I could slam dunk when I was working out, right? And so it's always like less about what the perceived culture is, I guess, of the melanin content of my skin, and more about like the experiences, right? And I think that's where we all as a collective group is looking more at the experiences and then less at what we see with our eyeballs. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else?
One thing to recognize is some of that comes from our own communities too. So like what you were talking earlier, it's not all the list of rules being handled by the colonizer or the settler. Those rules get taken and interpreted within our own communities, and then anybody trying to change that then becomes an outlier also. So that's the depth of this effort at kind of forcing one set of rules on people, is that those people can absorb the darker sides of that and then try and keep other people from breaking out. So it is a constant battle, and you just have to, I find myself having to recognize, like I said earlier, that we all have these things that we're fighting, and we're all caught up in this undertow of having to be a certain way, and we're all struggling in different ways to break out of that. But yeah, it's a constant challenge. I was on a panel at a literary festival a couple of years in Crested Butte, Colorado, and I was the only non-white person on this panel, and a woman in the audience directed a question at me, and her first words were, "Now I know Indians don't have the internet, so how do you guys communicate?" And the other three people on the panel, I just felt them like, oh shit. How do you answer that, right? I mean, how do you answer a question that is just so drowning in ignorance? And all I said was, as well, actually we do have the internet, and we've used it to develop whole new ways to not get along with each other. just like everybody else, and that was it.
Awesome. I really appreciate that. How we get, I think, get asked the question and so forth, and I think you have a really good question there. I mean, I grew up highly assimilated. My parents were educators. They were both white. I was adopted, and this is pre-NICWA. So I'm like that product of that scoop era generation, right? And for me growing up, I think some of my earliest identity to Indigenous people was Nakoma on Grizzly Adams. I don't know, anybody remember Grizzly Adams? And he was like leather tasseled and like hardly spoke, and he was very like stoic and serious, and but always had like good things to do and be. And I remember looking at that thinking, that's pretty cool. But at the same time, there was this recognition from a child through into adulthood where it was like, I will only ever be the imitation of that, trying to be that. And so for me, it was a real catch-22 where it wasn't until later in life where I was connecting to the Blackfeet, the Pekani, that I was, the hair was growing, and I tried it on before, but it felt like being someone else. Again, I felt like I was re-assimilating in a way to that caricature, if you will, because all I ever knew about it was on TV and in Looney Tunes cartoons and et cetera, right? To the Disney interpretations. That was what I had to go on, and it so deeply lacked an authenticity for me that I just went ahead with the other look that I was being pushed into, right? Raised Catholic, in Catholic school, holy crap. To where I am now. And I even followed the tracks of the people who brought me up, my parents, and went into higher education. And because it's an area that I'm comfortable, right? Comfortable being in and around. But again, have worked really hard to not be that trope. My brother, who I was adopted with, was exactly the opposite. Dude was like, he loved, what was the name of the movie about the four outlaws? Emilio Estevez was one of them. Do you remember the name?
Young Guns?
Young Guns, yeah, that one was playing all the time. He couldn't watch that movie enough. And he had that, that's where he really started playing sort of this identity and has immersed himself now in the Lummi tribe up in the Northwest because that's where he's at. And so he's found a community, but I think for us it comes clumsily, right? Because we do feel pushed back to these other things, and you hear about that internalized tension and who are we supposed to be, who are we not supposed to be, blood quantum, et cetera. There's just so much where we're just torn up internally, and I think that's a very important question because it is this byproduct of assimilation.
I recently, just in like a effort to kind of reattach myself to the joys of my youth, I took all of the artwork and stuff that I had in the wall facing my desk, which I spend a lot of time at, and replaced it with images from the stuff that I really loved when I was a kid. It was all fantasy art. So there's some vintage Tolkien poster, Lord of the Rings, and a bunch of things from Dragon magazine, the old Dungeons and Dragons art, and you gotta Frank Frazetta, the Conan art and stuff, and there's a poster of Elric of Melniboné, who was this hero by this English artist, Michael Moorcock, and Elric had this black sword that would steal souls of anybody he killed. And so one day I'm looking at that, I'm kicked back in my chair, and I'm looking at all this art, and I'm thinking, every one of these people is a white person. Every single one. I mean, even the hobbits are just little white dudes, right? Gandalf, he's the white beard society guy. And even Conan the Barbarian, he's a barbarian at least, but he's a white dude. Elric is literally a fucking albino. He is an albino. You don't get any whiter than albino. And I'm thinking all of this stuff that I loved so much was just contrary to what I'm trying to attach to now. I mean, like I said, Conan was a barbarian. Aragorn sometimes was depicted as at least being kind of Indianish. He was a ranger, right? He shot with a bow. That's kind of Indian, right? So that's just how deeply assimilated I was in ways that I was 50 years old before I realized that that was going on my whole life. So yeah, Nakoma.
I mean, images of Boris Vallejo's work of
Yes.
like that fantasy art stuff comes to mind. And again, some of my earliest like visual art sort of influences are like, I want to really learn how to paint the veins in the muscle, dude. Yeah, because, you know, that was like what I was looking at, right? That was the world that I was being introduced to. Any other questions that we have in the audience, please? In the back.
Michelle, earlier you mentioned the two women dancers, I think in New York, that didn't want to be identified as BIPOC dancers, even for grants or anything like that. So what do you think in terms of, you know, reclaiming, whether it's your, you know, cultural, ethnic, racial identities as BIPOC versus just being an artist? Because, you know, to you as participants, we give you the option. Do you want to identify as something? Do you just want to be identified as an artist? And so what are the pros and cons as a BIPOC artist today, identifying with BIPOC artists or just artists?
Yeah, it's such a great question because my history with this was, I wasn't in spaces where I needed to put that out there. So I think there is something, you know, what has come up in this conversation today around education, you know, and when is it, in what time is it a stepping stone? But it was just so interesting to hear these young college students say this to me in their frustration, that because they were being limited by it. So again, I think I'm curious about time and place. And I think we're figuring it out, you know, and I think that's an important thing to acknowledge too, that the answer is going to keep evolving. But I think in the moment it felt important to acknowledge that these young women were feeling this. So then, okay, what's the solution to this issue right here? Because I don't want to deny that this is true for them, that they feel limited by this container. So how do we shift the container? And I think that's the thing, is like when we try to shift our own selves to fit into a container. So they're expressing this to me, and that's what they're feeling. It's not in integrity with where they are right now. For others, I think in leading, like I feel like what you're sharing, Chris, is leading with this container because it's educational. You know, it's bringing new information to the field. It's enriching. And even, I gotta say this too, sitting next to you, like, I'm watching you, like, you said from when you were a kid, you were irritated. Is that what you said? Or irritation was a big thing?
I think I was irritated in the womb,
Okay.
actually. My mom can tell you.
Okay, and I mean, I think there's something beautiful in that too, because it's not my go-to, and I had to watch myself. I'm like, oh, I'm a little uncomfortable with this, but like, wow, that's his job, maybe. You know, like to be that the angry person or whatever. It's like their job. The peaceful person, it's their job. It's their nature, like nature, right? There's how many varieties of behaviors?
I'm still pretty fucking kind, though.
Yeah, but I just enjoyed personally that experience for myself. Like, oh wow, how cool that in relationship I'm getting to go through this. I guess I'm diverging, but maybe somehow it's connected. Everyone has a different means in the moment. What are you going to say?
Well, I have an answer to your question, because that's a big deal, like in the literary world. So, like if you go in the bookstore, like if you go into Fact and Fiction does a great job of making sure that the native artists are mixed in with all. If it's fiction, it's in fiction. If it's in nonfiction, it's in nonfiction. And what we would have is, because I used to work there up until a few years ago, we put what's called shelf talkers, not just Indigenous, but LGBTQ authors or women authors, because the problem is in the industry itself, white guys overwhelmingly get the best advances. They get the book contracts. They get the bylines in the big magazines. And part of the decolonization process of our world is making sure that everybody gets equal attention. So on the one hand, sometimes I'm mildly irritated by the fact that Indians get lumped together in this special section as Indigenous writers, and it almost just feels like getting shoved off onto a reservation again, a literary reservation, when some of the best writers happening right now are Indigenous and queer and women and all of these other things that is not a white guy. But so we have to make sure and give maybe more opportunity for those folks to make up for all the opportunities lost, even as we just want to sit all together at the same table. So it's kind of both, right? It's like, what's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Peanut butter or jelly, right? It's both.
I just want to say one thing. In this moment now, I'm realizing I don't think I said this to these women, but like, okay, there's the opportunity here. How can you creatively rework this to support what it is that's true for you? And I think that is the gift of the artist. You know, we can create new systems in response to what's going on. Or some of us, you know, we're wired differently. But I in hindsight, I wish I would have made that clearer to them, because that is an act of education in and of, like, they're not a victim to it. How am I going to work with this?
I think oftentimes also that you see the creation of those resources, right? Grants and so forth, particularly with grants, where the title and the intention and its purpose and its function doesn't come from us. It does. I mean, the language doesn't come from us, and how that is to be utilized and seen as possible levels of success upon usage of those resources. And so the idea of walking into another space where it's like, here's the white money for being brown, why don't you go and be a better brown person and be more like us, that whole comfortable thing, right, that we were talking about earlier. And when you're in that space, it's like, damn, I need money to go to school. This is expensive, and I want to get out of here with the degree and move on to blah, blah, blah. But then there's also sort of this bittersweetness that goes along with it. And so I think the part of the maybe a response to that is we would be better served by these things if we were more involved in the actual execution and planning and at a seat at the table when these things are being talked about and put forward. Because I think if they were framed in the right way, that question, that tension wouldn't exist, and you wouldn't have people at the starting gate saying, well, I don't know if I want that, because I'm this over here. You're not seeing that. And I think that that's the obvious response there, is that knee-jerk reaction to say, hey, I can't be what you want me to be, but you're going to give me the money anyway? It's like, so hopefully that helps sort of round that out. Over here.
Kind of goes along with that question, but it's kind of for Chris, but maybe I'll take an answer. You were talking about how your dad and your grandfather were they worked hard at denying their ancestry. What do you think they think of you, especially your dad? What do you think they would think now, seeing the path you're on? And do you think they'd be proud? Do you think they'd be ashamed? Do you think they'd be angry?
You know, I wonder about that, and sometimes the problem is I don't really know enough what he felt like really deep inside, because he wouldn't talk about it. So he built this whole stockade around his soul that he was not willing to let his soul proceed beyond. And then he piled, and my grandfather too, piled other kinds of trauma with alcohol abuse and who knows what else that I do not have. So I wonder, I just hope for the best, and I just hope that he would be as proud knowing where we come from as I am.
I mean, and this is getting really personal, and you two have your own story, and I'm sure similar to that, where some, people, you have a different path that you're on than your parents maybe were. But to answer Chris's question, I can't speak for his grandfather, but I can certainly speak for his father. And I think he would be thrilled, because it's something deep down I think he always wanted, but wasn't allowed because of what his dad expected. So I think he was waiting for you to go on his.
I think that's where we're all fortunate, is that we're in a generation that we don't have to worry if we're allowed or not. We're just going to freaking take it, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, my dad watches Fox News, so it's like if that paints a picture. There's a lot of love behind everything, but yeah, I remember he looked at my transcripts. It was like, look at all the A's and B's, and he looked down and saw the social work stuff and the native. And the only words that he uttered in that was under his breath, by the way, hippie liberal bullshit. And then walked out of the room. But I know the man loves me. I know he's proud of me for that fact. And that, I'm serving the community in the way that I do. But it's just who the guy is, right?
And don't you think sometimes that they're just waiting for somebody else to pick up what they were not necessarily afraid to do, but hadn't gotten permission?
Yeah, I think that's it too. I mean, my dad comes from a different generation, and he's East Coast, so it's like you're this or else. And I remember he said something when I was very young that if my boys, there was a time where he was saying that if my boys had grown their hair long, he would have dragged us down to the barber and shaved our heads, kind of a thing. And I remember thinking, oh, so glorious we don't live in that time, right? Because we were able to break away and become artists and musicians and follow our own voice and so forth, much to his chagrin. But it's in response to that.
Your dad sounds like my grandpa, who had to bribe me to cut my hair in 7th grade. Just touching on that, ancestral trauma, generational trauma, bloodlines, generational goals, from the top of the tree of life all the way to the bottom, right? For me, I don't know my biological dad. It's one of those many, many areas of my life where if you put out stereotypical black man, I can check a bunch of boxes, a whole bunch, which is some sort of cosmic irony for me that I do joke about and laugh a lot at. But my biological dad was a really talented athlete, and this is all what I know of him. Who then became a drug dealing pimp, who is now currently houseless on the streets of Billings. And so growing up with my sister, whom I'm really close to, she would look at me all the time and would be like, Riley, it terrifies me how much you're like our dad. I'm like, well, I don't know this person. What do you mean? And it's the whole nature versus nurture argument, right? And so I like to believe in my heart is okay, because I lived that path, right? I was houseless, I was addicted and on the streets of Billings. I missed being incarcerated with my dad by a matter of weeks. And so looking at that, I was like, okay, well, that's where my genetics kind of come from. This is this reciprocating pattern that's going on. And I have the blessing and the opportunity to now break that pattern, to now break that trauma cycle, not only for myself, but also for my dad, and also for whomever's going to come next, whether my lineage or my sister's lineage or whatever. I feel strongly about the energetic vibrations of just one person changing themselves and breaking a cycle, and then the impact that can have on everyone else. So I would love to meet the man someday, and I imagine he would be super stoked. I'm stoked on his life just from the fact that he existed, because I wouldn't be able to sit in this chair today and have this experience without him coming first and his dad before him and so on and so forth. So
I just want to say one thing about the essence of this question too. No matter who our parents are or what they did, we now have the gift of life. And what are we doing with that? And I know just in my work doing energy healing, one person heals, and I know it heals generations forwards and backwards. And I think we feel that. I think we feel that within ourselves, a resolve or maybe even a moment of communication. If someone's not here anymore, that's available to us. And I do believe we can't expect our parents with a 1940s consciousness to understand what we understand today. And I get really excited about what the next generation is going to bring to my 1970s consciousness. You know, it's like, I think it just speaks to wonder and the blessing of a person, because I think it's one of the hardest things for us to do is see our truth and not run away. And not everyone's going to do that. It's not everyone's job to. Like, then the game would be over in some ways, you know? So I think it's really important to honor that, because it's accepting a person for where they are, you know. And for me to be mad at my parents for not doing this or that person for not doing that, I'm not in the first act of accepting, which can then allow something to shift. So I also, I feel like none of this is in order to make that happen, because there's an end gaining in that ignores everything that's so rich in this moment around whether it's like my own anger or frustration about the situation, my own coming to a reconciliation about it, my own listening to, okay, what is my path in this journey that I've been blessed to be inside of? Thank God I have this gift of life.
Thank you so much for that. I know that others might have questions. Of course, we want to keep the conversation going and moving and so forth, but we're going to have to do it elsewhere. We are at the end of our hour, and of course, I want to make sure that we're honoring that time as well. Thank you, of course, to the ZAC for allowing us to utilize this space, and I want to invite, are you going to come up and do the outro, as it were? Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thanks for being part of this conversation. Let's again just really quickly hear it for our panelists and speakers. Thank you so much.
I have to come up here because Joseph can't think himself. So let's give them another round of applause. Thank you, Chris, Michelle, Riley, and Joseph. As always, these events are free and open to everyone, not just BIPOC people. We are so excited that you're here, and we love seeing and sharing with you. We aim to create a safe space that is an inviting place to learn and share our cultures. The Cohesion Advisory Committee is a team of all volunteer local arts and culture leaders, and I want to give our team a huge round of applause for putting this on and dedicating time and energy. It's really emotional work, and we are so thankful for everybody that has contributed to the Cohesion Art Collective. So if you're here, please wave up high so people can recognize you when I say your name. Stella Nall. Mia Hannock. Chrissy Ramirez, Michelle Boule, Janaina Vieira Marquez. She's on vacation with her kids. And Benji Head Swift, who's also on vacation with his kids.
And April.
Oh, thanks. And we want to give a huge thank you to the ZAC team for providing this beautiful space and hosting us for the second year in a row, which we are so thankful for. And thank you to MCAT that is filming our series this year. So if your friends couldn't make it, it will be available online. And if you want to rewatch it, it'll be available. Our next topic in this, yes, let's give MCAT a round of applause. Sorry about that. Our next topic in this three-part series is code switching, which it's near and dear to my heart, so I'm really excited for that theme next month, July 9th, 2 to 4 p.m., right here in this room. So thank you for coming, and we hope to see you next month.
Thank you, everybody.